So it is Saturday, a beautiful Saturday, September 19th, 2020. A feel of fall outside. Davina and I had a beautiful morning together, and she's upstairs. You can hear some water running in the background. That's her. She's preparing a meal for this evening. But in any case, my name is Jose Maso. Welcome to another edition of Con Salsa on Facebook and YouTube Live. This is my humble abode from which I am broadcasting D and J Studios. D for Divina, J for yours truly, Jose. And today we have a great program. So I'm hoping that you and your friends and family will join us during 2.5 hours of great music and conversation because we have some great guests. I'm looking forward to a memorable afternoon with each and every one of you. One of my field producers, Ryan Neufeld, tells me that he can hear me and see me. So that's a good sign. I'm glad to hear that. Chris Washburne, Dr. Chris Washburne, who will be our guest momentarily. He's already backstage getting ready to join us after we hear a little bit of music and whatnot. Jose Hernandez, saludos para ti y para Raúl Pollo. And also later, we will have some very special guests, including Bobby Sanabria, Ray Vega, Arturo Gomez, and Jaime Rodriguez. But I'll talk more about them a little bit later on. But the subject matter for today will be Latin jazz, the other jazz. And I hope that you will find this engaging, informative, and educational as well. Bueno, mi gente, bienvenidos a otra edición del programa Con Salsa por Facebook y YouTube Live. Llevo 45 años de aniversario en la programación de radio cada sábado por la noche por WBOR 90.9 FM en estereofónico, radiodifusión pública aquí en la ciudad de Boston. 45 años de radiodifusión, pero ahora estamos también sábado y domingo de 4 a 6 aquí en Facebook y YouTube Live, como también transmitiendo donde ustedes estén, escuchando y viendo esta programación. Yo prefiero YouTube, pero también aquellos que tienen Facebook, pues aquí me ven. Y el enlace para Facebook es @con salsa José Mazo. En YouTube, suscríbese a mi canal José Mazo para que puedan ver y escuchar el programa. So, Mary Kent is already saying that she can see me. And we're getting ready to go. Jose Hernandez, our dear friend, he's in Santa Barbara, California. So the way we're going to start off today's program was not really what I had intended. This was not the way I wanted to start today's program. But last night, many of you, if you didn't hear it last night, you would have heard it this morning. The unfortunate passing of the Supreme Court Justice Ruth Ginsburg, and that blew me away. That blew me away because, if anything, if there's something that we need to make sure of here in this country of the United States, is that the Supreme Court is really balanced in a way that they will look at each subject matter not from a political lens but from the judicial lens. And we're now at a crossroads because the next person who joins the Supreme Court will make a difference as to which direction the Supreme Court will be going for in the future generations. So if you're eligible to vote, I suggest and I urge and I ask each and every one of you to vote this coming November 3rd because we want to make sure that at least at that level, we keep things balanced. And that being said, we dedicate this show to her memory, notorious RBG, and knowing very well that even though she's no longer with us, her memory will live on. So to her, we dedicate this show. Let me put some music, and then we will continue with our guests. So stay right there. No se vayan.
Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, was blind, but now I see. Was grace that taught my heart to fear, and grace my fears relieved. How precious did that grace appear, the hour I first believed. Through many dangers, toils, and snares, I have already come. 'Twas grace that brought me safe thus far, and grace will lead me when we've been there 10,000 years, bright shining as the sun. We've known less days to sing God's praise than when we first begun. Hallelujah, hallelujah, amen. Hallelujah, hallelujah,
De vez en cuando hay que crear conciencia. Amanece un nuevo día y yo sigo en este encierro, viendo la calle vacía y ya se fue el bodeguero. Ya no creen en mascarillas, no hay papel ni medicinas, genocidas de oficina, dejan que se muera el pueblo. A mí que nadie me diga que no hay gato en el encierro. Nos llevan como ovejitas derechito al matadero. Ineptitud e ignorancia nos dejan con su fragancia. Hay que mantener distancia mientras se muere mi pueblo. Como del sobreviviente, quien tiene el sartén del mango rima con incompetente y eso es evidente. Frente en alto, vida, no hay mal que a ti te detenga. Te lo prometió el divino.
En alto, brega con la economisis, mantente bien positivo hasta que acabe la crisis.
No hay pandemia que te achante. Con tu frente en alto y brega. El remedio está en cuidarse, como hermanos ayudarse. Si es que la ayuda no llega. Este es Edwin Pérez. Edwin Edwin Pa'lante, siempre pa'lante.
Distanciamiento social,
No te aflijas, no te achantes, te tienes que levantar.
distanciamiento social,
Los que controlan no sirven, no te dejes engañar.
distanciamiento social,
Ay, mijito, ten cuidado, que sufre más el de abajo y no lo puedes negar.
social,
Te completas la cuartilla, no hay bata ni mascarilla para el que te puede salvar.
social,
Ya lo dijo un eminente, que cuando controla un demente te tienes que emancipar. Mi respeto a policías y personal de hospital que con un calmo en la mente salen a dar a curar. ¡Hey! Y la verdad hay que decirla. ¿Cómo no? Edwin Pérez. Edwin Who. Edwin Pérez.
si te cuidas volveremos a janguear.
Tranquilo, no te me achantes ahora, tirando pa'lante siempre, con fe pasará la hora.
Si te cuidas volveremos a janguear.
Si el que manda te abandona y no hay ayuda federal, haz un poco más de esfuerzo, tú te tienes que ayudar.
Te cuidas volveremos a janguear.
Salidas innecesarias para beber y para gozar, terminan siendo antesala para tu propio funeral. Para esta situación ya no hay devolución, adopta la evolución y tu vida cambiará. Es mejor estar a 6 pies de distancia que 6 pies bajo la tierra.
Y sigue la salsa con Salsa y José Mazo.
Bueno, mi gente, escucharon a Edwin Pérez, su nueva propuesta musical, Economisis, una letra que lo dice todo. Al comienzo dice, de vez en cuando hay que crear conciencia. Al final dice, mejor estar 6 pies de distancia que 6 pies bajo la tierra. Así que cojan escuela. Edwin Pérez, gracias por esa propuesta musical. Comenzamos dándole reconocimiento a condolencias debido a la muerte de la jueza suprema de los Estados Unidos ayer a la edad de 87 años. Y para nosotros una pérdida enorme aquí en los Estados Unidos, así que estaremos pendientes cómo se desarrollan las cosas. De cualquier manera, escuchamos la canción que fue dedicada a Notorious RBG, que era el nombre que le dieron a ella siendo la jueza suprema de la Corte Suprema de los Estados Unidos, Ruth Bader Ginsburg. So we dedicated that first song and today's show to the memory of Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, the notorious RBG, who will be missed, as I said, but never forgotten. You can't spell truth without Ruth, and that is so. Amen to that. So I see some of my guests already lining up. Chris Washburne will be joining me quickly. Jaime Rodriguez from Puerto Rico is ready backstage. Ray Vega, who I have not seen in so long, is in the house as well. Looking forward to him joining the roundtable discussion during the second hour. And we'll be joined also by Bobby Sanabria and Arturo Gomez during that roundtable discussion with our invited guest, Dr. Chris Washburne. So stay tuned right where you are. And I hope you enjoyed today's show. Spread the news. Share this with as many people as possible. Let them know that they can go to my Facebook page and just link in at Con Salsa Jose Maso, and I think it shows up in blue, so just link into there, and then they will be part of this. And I'm looking forward to some great music and conversation. And some of the good people who are out there, and yes, I'm happy that the music that I bring to you in the conversation hopefully will bring you joy and happiness. And the West Coast, saludos maestro, tremendo swing. He's going to be on soon. He'll be joining me, a matter of fact, next weekend. He'll be with us, John Santos. Let's continue more music right here. Get ready, because this is part of the conversation. Pay attention, pongan atención. Esto será parte de la conversación que tendremos pronto con el doctor Chris Washburne. Chano Pozo.
Predict what the guy was going to do next. And those kind of people with a million ideas. Just the same thing they apply with his playing. He never played conga like all these conga players around. They got a set of rhythm, they play and they play. No. He always finds something to fit in different. That's what this value him so big.
Later that year, he recorded again with Dizzy, taking a new and commanding presence on older tunes, like George Russell's Cubana B, Cubana Bop, and collaborating with Gillespie, singing out the melodies and rhythms that would become standards, like Tin Tin Dale and Manteca.
Chano come to me and say, I got an idea. I got the idea. He say, boom, boom, boom. Boom, 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 boom. Boom, 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 boom. As he say, bajo. He named the instrument bass for that lick. He said, okay, the bajo does that. Saxophone come in, boom, bing, boom, bing, boom, bing, while the bass is doing that. You hear this multi-rhythm going, boom, bing, boom, bing, boom, bing. He say, while the saxophone's doing boom, bing, boom, bing, boom, boom, trombone doing boom, boom, bing, bing, boom, 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 bing, boom, bing, boom, bing, boom, boom, bing, bing, boom, boom. And then trumpet, boom, boom, ba-dee, bing, ba-doom, boom, ba, boom, ba-dee, bing, ba-doom, boom, ba. That's the arrangement right there. Now, that's not only the composition, but that is the arrangement too. So the bass started it off, the saxophone came in, the trombone came in that, the trumpets had that one note. And then he didn't say how that was going to end, but Gil Fuller put and then wrote the arrangement. And then Chano had the melody for the first 8 bars. Dun 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 dun. I wrote the bridge, so I figured it needed something like that. So I wrote the bridge, like you put the harmony, and then Gil Fuller put the rest of it together for the arrangement, and that was it.
And there you heard the voices of Billy Taylor, Mario Bauza, Dizzy Gillespie, talking about the great Chano Pozo, the Afro-Cuban percussionist who, along with Dizzy Gillespie, of course, recorded some of the iconic songs and melodies that we associate with Latin jazz, Manteca being one of them, Tintindeo being another. And to talk about this and other subject matter around this particular subject. Today, I thought I would bring a lion and other lions, known as the Pride of Lions, to tell us their version and their vision and their thoughts with regards to Latin jazz and jazz in general, particularly as we celebrate Hispanic Heritage Month. And I wanted to bring this group together because I have so much respect and admiration for each and every one of them for who they are and what they've done and what they continue to do as lions. And when I say lions, today, if there's a day in which we have to recognize the African proverb, until the lion tells the story of the hunt, the hunter will always be glorified. Until the lion tells the story of the hunter will always be glorified. So I've gathered a pride of lions so that we can speak about this and speak truth to power in a way that hopefully will enlighten all of us and at the same time inspire all of us to even dig deeper into the roots of our music. And to start things off, it's my honor, it's my privilege, it's my pleasure to welcome my very special guest, Dr. Chris Washburne. He is a author of 2 books, including the latest, which you just saw posted there, Latin Jazz. And also before that, another great book, Sounding Salsa. He has recorded over 150 albums. He's a trombonist. He has his own band. See You on the Other Side is the name of the band, and which we'll talk about that at some moment in time, I'm sure. And at the same time, he's a professor at Columbia University. So it's my honor and pleasure to welcome you, Chris, here to the show today. And you're looking well, my dear friend. You're looking very well. How are you?
Well, I'm fine, and I'm so glad to be here. I'm really honored. You are one of my heroes in a very important cultural warrior in promoting this music and disseminating it and spreading the good word. So thank you so much for the invitation.
Well, thank you. The moment that I read that the book was going to come out, I said, I'm going to get the book and I'm going to invite Christopher to join us, because if there's anybody that I want to share some time with, it's you. And we have a Boston connection, obviously, because you came here to study. So why don't we at least take a couple of minutes just to set the stage as to who you are, because some people may not know you that way. Where were you born, and when did the music thing come in, and then how was it you wound up at Boston?
Well, I was born in a small rural town in Ohio, and lived a large portion of my childhood on a farm. And, there's a reason why the rock and roll capital of the world is in Cleveland. That was really what I was kind of born and raised on, and always aspired to be a rock and roll star. And of course, I picked the trombone. So that was a little bit tricky trying to pursue that career as a trombonist. I went to school at the University of Wisconsin-Madison to study classical trombone and to study jazz trombone. And I remember when I was out there, I saw a bunch of studio musicians from New York come through in the Gil Evans Orchestra. And I said, you know what? I want to do that. I want to end up in New York, and I want to make records for a living. But I certainly wasn't good enough at that time. So I applied to New England Conservatory in Boston to get a master's. But not to get just any master's, but to get a master's in third stream studies, which is an unusual kind of improvisational program that really explores the mixing of different traditions to kind of come up with something new. It was started by the great composer and conductor Gunther Schuller, and then my teacher was Rand Blake, that was running that program for many, many years. And so that's how we kind of come together in Boston a little bit. But also Boston plays a significant role because it's the reason that I got introduced to Latin music. And it was a late night one night at New England Conservatory, and I had joined the Latin, or I guess it was the Afro-Cuban band in New England Conservatory. It was run by a couple of musicians from Spain and Japan, and they taught us kind of like the basics. And I was playing one night, practicing one of the songs, and there was a knock on my practice room door. And there's a trombone player that still lives in Boston, still very active, Jim Nesbar, who played in a lot of Latin bands at the time. And he knocked on the door, and he worked at New England Conservatory at that time. And he said, "Hey, you sound pretty good. I need a sub tonight. Can you please go in my place?" And I said, "Well, what is the gig?" And he says, "Oh, it's this Colombian band. They play salsa and merengue, and just wear a jacket and tie and play really loud. They're going to really love you." And that was all the instructions that I had. And it was in a small little club north of Boston. And I showed up at the gig. I was just thrilled to have a gig, to be
Sure.
professionally. And, it was love at first hearing for me. All of a sudden, I found a music where the trombone could really play a central role, almost like a lead guitar role. I found a place where I could kind of do the rock and roll thing. The music was just infectious. I had no idea what it was, what the history was, or anything.
You just got into it. So Boston,
Small
yeah.
little mom and pop's record store. And I think it was on Boylston. I cannot remember exactly where it was. It was not far from Berkeley. And it's not there anymore. And I remember that I went there the next day after the gig because I wanted to find out more about this music. And I went into the store, and lucky for me, the guy behind the desk must have been Puerto Rican or Cuban. And when I came in and I said, I played this in this band, this salsa band last night. I really dig it. I want to get some records and learn about it. And he looked at me with his glint in the eye, like a sparkle in the eye. And he handed me 2 records. He said, "This is all you'll ever need."
And which one were they?
Okay. And he said, and there were 2 Eddie Palmieri records. One was The Son of Latin Music, and one was The White Album.
There you go.
As soon as I found out I was a trombone player, that's where you sent me. And after that, then I was hooked, man. Then it was just a whole lifetime.
All right. So Boston and Chris, hold on a second. Listen to this. Bobby Sanabria is in the background. He's going to love this one. Song with a Cuban attitude, a New York attitude would be what Bobby Sanabria would say, who's going to join us shortly. That's a track that you recorded, the Eureka song, and it was recorded by Bobby Sanabria, the big band Afro-Cuban Dream, live in Clave. And of course, when we think about New York, we have to think about the New Yorican connection, as well as the Cuban connection to Latin music and to jazz. So Boston plays a smart role in you at least getting your toe into the water, but you really went in and swam once you got into New York. And before we speak more about that, today's subject matter is Latin Jazz, the Other Jazz, the book that you have brought forth, which I believe right now is going to be the book from now on that we're going to look at as the baseline, right? The one that's going to establish our knowledge and say, okay, everything from now on is going to be because we learned it from Dr. Christopher Washburne. Why this book, and why do you title it Latin Jazz, the Other Jazz?
Well, first, Jose, I want to just say that the months ago, of course, in the midst of COVID, and so we were planning on having a book party and a big concert and celebration, and we put that off. But I must say, you're the first person to invite me to talk about it in public. So I'm really happy that this is the venue that launches this. This is like the unofficial launch of the book in some.
Thank you. I'm honored. I'm honored. I'm honored. I'm honored. I'm truly honored.
But the thing is that I always tried to think about scholarship and writing in the same way that I think about composing and performing. And I want to incorporate whatever I compose and I perform, I try to write about it at the same time. And that's the reason why Sounding Salsa came out. But it's also the reason why Latin jazz came about, because I've been performing Latin jazz since my Boston days. And this book was really a labor of love. And it was something that I've always wanted to write. And it's about years of experiencing myself as, a white musician from the United States, working in a variety of different milieus that have a variety of different racial and ethnic and national dynamics, and seeing how I was able to navigate some things that other people weren't. I was excluded from some things that other people weren't, and seeing how so many of the great salsa musicians that I performed with were also great jazz players, and they were not getting some of the same opportunities that some of my friends, African-American friends, and white friends were getting. And I wanted to kind of get and address that. And then, of course, in the midst of playing, we get the great Ken Burns coming out with this great story of jazz, right? And, all of a sudden we're watching it from the beginning, and it's captivating filmmaking, and it's really talking about some of the jazz greats. And just all of a sudden we just noticed that there's nothing about Latin jazz, or very, very, very little, and it was like, it almost didn't exist. And I'm thinking to myself, man, what the music that I'm playing night after night is just being completely not recognized. And I also noticed when we would get booked, my own SYOTOS band would get booked in various festivals, we wouldn't get booked in jazz slots. We wouldn't get booked in jazz festivals, or if we would be just like relegated to this side thing, this Latin jazz thing. No, that's something different. And as I studied jazz history, I couldn't understand why people thought that was anything different than the jazz tradition. And so the book Latin Jazz, The Other Jazz, is referring to how people perceive this oftentimes is they other the musicians, they other the sounds and the whole tradition, and they just write out of history people like Machito, people like Mario Bauzat. They just not even mentioned, and maybe Chano Pozo gets a footnote, or someone made a comment, thanks for Dizzy acknowledging the other maestro, right?
Yeah.
Because it's Dizzy and Chano Pozo, but Chano also had a very important role in all of this, and he also had an illustrious career himself. And so this is me trying to rewrite history. It's a revisionist historical study on how Latin jazz gets written out of history, gets erased, gets pushed to the side, and that maybe it shouldn't be, and maybe it should be more centered. And so the argument of this book is Latin jazz actually emerged first.
That's why you're one of the lions that I have invited for today, because I truly believe that. I believe that, I posted yesterday the idea that the person who's sitting at the White House right now wants to rebrand education to be in his liking, and in his liking is patriotic. It's this myth of what the United States is, eliminating anything having to do with any part of their history of the United States that has to do with oppression, with suppression, with slavery, with any of that, and this illusion of white supremacy of what he wants to present, right? Whereas he attacks the 1619 Project out of New York Times because he sees that as being leftist or trying to rewrite history. Well, it's trying to really tell history, right? Our dear friend Ruben Blades had told us months ago when he joined us, he said, we've got to relearn what we've learned to learn what we really need to learn. And so when I started reading your book, that's what came to my mind, that as I was reading it, I was relearning the things that I was learning that I needed not to remember as being the things that I needed to learn, but that I needed to learn new things. And you did such a meticulous job of really digging in deeply with your research. We're going to talk about, some of that, how you did it in different chapters and things of that nature. But let me just do some quick saluditos here. So you've got greetings from Baba Andrew Lamb, says saludos. We have greetings here. Alyssa says, saludos, Jose, Dr. Washburne, the best educators of Latin jazz genre in the world. Well, pretty soon you're going to see others who are going to join this group, and you will see that we have quite a few. So, you posit an interesting thought when I'm reading your book because you not only do it in a way where you have case studies, but you do it in a way where you have, like Ned Sublet says, where you have the receipts, right? Where you really have the documentation that goes along with what you are proposing and what you're stating. And it's interesting because here we are in the year 2020, where you would think because the Latino community, which again is not monolithic, continues to grow in numbers, and there are different genres within that Latino community. And you know it well because you've traveled through Latin America. And speaking about traveling for Latin America, those of you who are watching, especialmente los salseros, yo tengo un video del doctor Chris Washburne tocando con la India en una gira que hicimos por Venezuela. Yo creo que fue en el 91. Rubén Blades, Guaco y la India. Y Chris estaba tocando con la banda de la India. Y llegó un concierto donde la banda de Rubén, Son de Solar, con Jimmy Bosch en los trombones. También estaba Louis Kahn, el fenecido Louis Kahn en el trombón. Llegó la pieza Plantación Adentro, que ustedes saben que es una tremenda canción, especialmente para los trombones. Y el doctor Chris Washburn fue invitado para que tocara con ellos. Entonces, los tres trombones, Chris, Jimmy y Louis Kahn, se van al frente para hacer los solos. Y es un tremendo recuerdo de tremenda música. Algún día, cuando yo tenga la habilidad de editarlo, lo voy a pasar para que ustedes vean ese día tan memorable de la música nuestra, como también la participación de Chris Washburn en nuestra música. So you've traveled through Latin America, so you know it's not monolithic, but you have specifically decided that this is the music you want to concentrate because of the jazz connection, right? When I started the show, Chris, and you would hear it when you were here in Boston, I started because there was a connection between Latin music and jazz. So I knew that I was in the right place, especially 45 years ago when we had so much jazz program in WBUR. But let's talk about the idea that even those that play jazz, it's not just the promoters, it's not just the record companies, it's not just the art critics, if you will, those who review, et cetera, but even those in the jazz genre, the community of jazz, look at us as being, when I say us, look at Latin music, Latin jazz as being the other. Speak a little bit about that.
Well, that happens over and over and over again. And it really is tied to, I believe, the fundamental racial dynamics in this country. I mean, the United States, since the court ruling of Plessy versus Ferguson, or the one-drop rule, for instance, it's a black and white binary in terms of race. And it has been for years and years. Either you're black or you're not. And of course, people coming from the Caribbean and Latin America disrupt that, incredibly so. I remember Mario Balza would share the story that when he would travel with the black bands throughout the South, they couldn't get served in many restaurants, and it would be really difficult to tour. And oftentimes they'd have to have their own Pullman cars, and because they couldn't have hotels or whatever. And he would walk in. They'd send him into a restaurant. And he was an Afro-Cuban man, and he would walk in, and they would say, "You can't be served here," and he would say, "I'm not black, I'm Cuban," with that thick Cuban accent that he spoke with. And they didn't know what to do with that. And so that gives us a key point in to this whole trajectory of history where if all of the conversation is around black and white, there's no space for the mulatto, the brown, the tan, the beige, or whatever. It's just completely excluded. And within jazz, that dynamic has played out over and over and over again. And especially as jazz becomes more and more commercially marginalized throughout the 1970s and into the current state, it's harder and harder for musicians to make money. And it's harder and harder for musicians to just solely live on jazz alone. And so what happens is that the cultural capital of claiming jazz as your own, or as a black music, let's say, or an African-American music, which it is. It's a black music. It is an African-American music.
Yeah.
It just doesn't allow for space for people that come from other places or don't self-identify as white or black. Where do they fit in all of this? And so oftentimes it's just easy to exclude them. And I remember your guests from last week, the great show with Johnny Rodriguez and Jose Madero. Yeah, he said Madeira. She said to Jose said to me once. He said, it's a known fact is that jazz musicians don't really spend time learning how to play Latin rhythms, and they don't play it well. And Latin musicians spend a lot of time learning how to play jazz, and there's not, it's not an equal relationship, and there's a lot of gatekeeping, and when you're got a small little pot and you're trying to protect it, letting other people in or other perspectives in divides it even more so, and it can be viewed as a threat. So kind of I would say that the discourse around jazz, especially since the 1980s and moving on into the current time, is that it's an African American art form. It's a Black thing. It's kind of centered as American music, and when they say that, they mean just the United States, not the other Americas, without any acknowledgement of that. And people take a protectionist stance.
Let's listen to this in the background. Tanga. Machito, the Afro-Cubans. Carambola is the title of the album. Machito on vocals along with his sister Graciela featuring Zoot Sims and Brew Moore live at the Birdland 1951, the album Carambola. You're hearing their version of Tanga, which would be, of course, one of the classic recordings of that era and continues to be so today. So when you hear, as a matter of fact, I'm going to ask you to forgive me 1 second. Everybody who's watching the show, this is real-time emergency. So my beautiful wife, Divina, just texted me to tell me she locked herself out of the house. She's got her dog. So give me 30 seconds for me to go upstairs, bring her into the house, all right? So forgive me for a second. Divina acaba de darme un text que está fuera, no tiene la llave, así que quiero ir arriba para abrir la puerta. Don't go away. This is real-time emergency, all right? Stay there. I always say this show is organic. It's not planned, so there's an example of why it's organic. But she apologizes. So going back to what we were talking about as far as the jazz performers. So when you hear Tanga, and you write about Tanga, and you write about Machito, and you write about Mario Bauza in his role as far as the bridge, right? When you hear Tanga in the context of Latin jazz, the other jazz, what comes to mind for you?
Well, for me, it's really that's the second birth of Latin jazz in some ways. It's just
You froze a little bit there, Chris. Christopher, we lost you. Well, hopefully we can get him back on momentarily as he was answering that question. Ray Vega is doing his slick. Bobby Sanabria is back there. Jaime Rodriguez as well. And I think Chris is back. Okay, we've got you. Thank you, Chris. Okay.
I'm back. Sorry about that.
That's all right. So the second coming.
Yeah, it's a reawakening of a connection that had been there right from the past. And one of the things that Machito did and Mario Bauza did was bring this notion of kind of a shared history between African-American culture and also Afro-Cuban culture, and just sounded it out. You know, they brought to the fore of how these musics can kind of come together so seamlessly and easily with very little effort, kind of bridging the divide between Fifth Avenue, like the east of Fifth Avenue and Spanish Harlem, and west of Fifth Avenue, which was Black Harlem. And so when I'm hearing that, it's just finally this articulation of, hey, this is what it's always been. This relationship has been intrinsically tied from the very, very beginnings. Because in my book, this is really, for me, it's the 1716 project, which was the first moment when enslaved peoples were brought to New Orleans, and that's kind of the establishment of New Orleans as an economic center. And where did they come from? They came from Martinique, Guadeloupe, and other places within the West Indies. And so actually the first generation of enslaved peoples that transformed that city in some ways were really Afro-Caribbeans. And it was from that place that we get the center of African-American culture and expressive culture, and especially the birth of jazz. That's where it emerges from. So the very foundations are indeed what we hear in Tanga. And that's what's so interesting. And also Tanga supposedly is a West African word. And so they're making connections on a lot of different levels.
Yes, our dear friend Mary Kent, who will be our guest tomorrow, says in Africa, Tanga is marijuana. So, well,
yes, it is in some African language, according to a number of musicians. And Mary, it's great to see you. Thanks.
She'll join us tomorrow. Mary Kent, photographer and author of Salsa Talks. She'll be our guest tomorrow with another roundtable discussion. John Santos, our dear friend, who will be our guest next weekend, congratulates you and says, can't wait to read the book. It's en route, loving sounding salsa, and I'm already love the new one. That's true. We all love the new one. And
John,
so,
it's great to hear from you too. John is such an important warrior on the left coast of America, and he's someone that I've been able to collaborate with in a number of ways, and it's always a wonderful experience. Keep up the great work, John.
And so, prior to this book coming out, I mean, you've had that thought, Latin jazz, the other jazz, for a while. You had an assignment, or at least you had an opportunity to lean in on this book, Apollo Ain't Nothing Like the Real Thing, How the Apollo Theater Shaped American Entertainment. And it was interesting the way you speak about that experience, right? Because again, it goes back to, oh, wait a minute, shouldn't we include Latin music in the history of Latin music at the Apollo? Please expand on that.
Well, that was a really interesting story that kind of fed into this book project by accident. I was contacted by the editors of this book a month before the final product was due, saying, hey, could you help us out? Could you write a chapter on the role Latin music performance at the Apollo Theater? And this was a book that was going to go along with the Smithsonian exhibit for the 75th anniversary of the theater. So, there was a chapter on James Brown. There was a chapter on the dancers. There was a chapter on all of the major performers that had played at that theater throughout since its founding in the 1930s. And I thought it was so strange that they would contact me so late. So obviously someone around that editorial board said, wait a minute, maybe we should include, some Latin music. So again, it's another example how it's othered, like marginalized, right? Okay, and I said, well, how much space? And they said, we'll give you 2,000 words. And 2,000 words is nothing. It's just a few pages. And granted, James Brown got like 10 pages in this book and things like that. And so I said, well, all right, it was a paid gig, but Bobby Sinabre had a gig in Denver, and we were on tour when I got this assignment. So I said, well, I'm on tour right now. I said, but can you just give me the access to the Library of Congress files, and I'll just start to research it. And as I was researching it, I kept finding more and more examples of Latin music, dating back all the way from 1934, all the way up until it closed. And even after it closed and kind of reopened a few times. And I was sitting on the bus on the way to a gig where Arturo Gomez, I think, was at that gig. He was the MC. And sitting next to me was Gene Jefferson, who was a Panamanian saxophone player. At that time, he was in his probably mid to late 70s. And he looked at me and said, what are you working on? And I told him. He said, I was in the house band in the 1960s. Well, the significance of that is that at the Apollo, the one thing about the Apollo is no one was allowed to bring in their band. They all came in as like solo artists, unless they were huge stars. This would mean that the lead alto player in the 1960s at the Apollo was from Panama. And he was playing with every single major black artist that came through that stage. What's the significance of that? When I started to peel the onion layers away, I realized there was so much there. And I found out that Machito played more weeks at the Apollo Theater than Duke Ellington did or Count Basie did. What does that mean? And that's throughout the 1940s and into the 1950s and 60s. I started to rethink the Apollo as not only America's most important stage for African American cultural expression in music, but it also was one of the key stages for Latin American and Caribbean music performance. And it's also the reason I finally figured out the reason why so many African Americans went to the Palladium in Midtown to listen to the mambo bands. Why? Because they had all been introduced for years to rumba, to the conga and mambo and all of the other dance crazes. It was just, they were huge fans. And it was the Apollo, it was kind of the nexus for that interchange. And so I called the publishers back. I said, I need 10,000 words and I need a lot more time because this is a really big assignment, and they agreed. And so they were enlightened, and I was able to write also a chapter on Celia Cruz and her performing there as well. So that was great, and portions of that chapter appear in this new book, and then I greatly expanded and did more research because I had more space.
I love that. I love the piece that you wrote and how you expanded, but also you say the nexus is because, and Bobby will speak about this, and anybody who was raised in New York, especially if you were in barrio. I mean, the barrio in Spanish Harlem and Black Harlem, I mean, it was just like your neighbors. You're right, you cross the street. It's the same thing of, when you're walking down the street, you're going to hear a lot of different music back then coming from different homes. And so, yes, and I can't tell you, this the number of friends that I have from New York who are African American, and they will dance Latin music like in a minute, right? Because, again, it was just like, it would be like eating rice and beans and eating rice and beans, right? The only difference was this one had a little bit of Latino flavor, this one had a little bit of Southern flavor, and in the Apollo and also in the book, the Latin Jazz, the Other Jazz, there's an interesting, you had access to a lot of information, and what I looked at was not just the photos. There's in the Apollo, in this book, I believe there's a page where you have notes and the fees that Tito Puente received over a period of time. And the notes that I guess was from the promoter talking about the band and talking about the performance. And then in your book, you have one for Eddie Palmieri. Touch a little bit about the one in the Apollo.
Well, that was the access that I got for the Library of Congress, their archives of the Apollo, and it's the Frank Schiffman archives. And he was the owner of the Apollo, but also was very much involved in the booking. And of course, this is pre-computer, so he had these index cards that he would keep on every single major performer that came through, and he would document how much he paid, how long they played, whether he was going to have them come back or not, and also a couple notes about them. And it's funny because I came across Eddie Palmieri, who's also played there many, many times. And when it was him, the note basically says, "Oh, two trombones, interesting sound. I will invite him back." And it wasn't, but this also points to the importance of the Apollo because it wasn't Eddie's first appearance there. The first appearance came, I think, back in 1954 in Amateur Night when he showed up with a small Latin jazz quartet. This was before anybody knew who Eddie Palmieri was. And they played and they didn't win, but they came like they were runner up or third place. So they all got a prize, a consolation prize of a wallet. That also shows you that in the 50s, there were Latin jazz and Latin music artists that were also competing at those amateur nights that still, have been going on for many, many, many years. And that's another way that even in the 1950s, they saw that as a place, as a launching pad for their own careers.
Well, I love the notes that were written in that index card. I'm going to share them. This is what it says about Tito Puente and band. On 6/12/55 or 53, he paid $2,700. First appearance, good mambo band. Puente is a very cooperative person. No drawing power. And then later, it says in 5/7/54, Mambo Rumba Festival, played entire show for Mambo Rumba Festival. Good. Paid him $3,000. There's another one. Okay, back in 54, paid him $2,800. And he says contract price $2,750 plus $96 for 2 house rehearsal. A highly intelligent and capable musician, talking about Tito Puente. The band is excellent and it seems to be quite popular. He got paid $3,000 in September of 1955. Good performance, some popularity. was well paid as indicated price. And then it goes on to say a couple of other things. But it's just interesting to get the perception of Puente from the perspective of this particular person at this particular time, this is priceless. That part of the book is priceless. And you've done the same thing with Palmieri in your book.
And mind you, that person was the most powerful person in black music, right? Because he was the gatekeeper, even though he was, a Jewish guy that was the owner. He was really the gatekeeper who got booked. And those prices were for week performances. So that would be 7 performances and performed for several shows a night, or 2 to 3 shows a night. So that was a huge amount of people that they were being exposed to. Those shows were selling out.
Amazing, amazing. Let's go to some notes here. Irashi says, saludos, que alegría verte. Bendición, primo, me alegro verte también. Aquí, Julia Ojeda, I need to get a copy of this book. So speaking about copy of this book, so this is the book we just mentioned, Apollo Ain't Nothing Like the Real Thing, in which Dr. Washburne contributed a chapter, but his book is the one that we're speaking about, the Latin jazz, the other jazz. So this is the book. Let me take the comment out so you can see it. This is the book right there. You can order it from Amazon. It's available, and you'll be able to enjoy this great read. And it is a lot of information. I have to say, Dr. Washburn, you were very meticulous in just gathering so much rich information that every time I would get to it, I'd underline it and underline another one, saying, this is priceless. So listen to this. You say that you title one chapter, I think it's chapter 5, you titled it El Tema del Apolo, El Tema del Apolo. And before we get to that, which we were talking about Palmieri, Eggy Castillo says, great information. Where can I find the book? Eggy, I just thought on Amazon. You can order it there. Aquí Mary Kent, those rates sound pretty high for that period in time. Am I wrong? Well, explain that.
Think about it, Mary. It's 6 nights and 2 to 3 shows a night. So divided up with the entire band. So it's high, but not that high.
There you go. So it was like, it wasn't for a one night gig. It was like many nights and many sets. So el capítulo titulado El Tema del Apolo es donde tú hablas sobre la presencia latina caribeña en el Teatro Apolo en Nueva York, ¿no? On 125th Street. So that theme by Eddie Palmieri is basically where Eddie, in many ways, was acknowledging the audience, because when you hear the lyrics, and I'm going to play it momentarily, when you hear the lyrics and you hear my good friend Ismael Quintana, the late Pat Quintana, say what he says, para los Nietzsche, you quickly understand who the audience is, El Tema del Apolo, who it was for. So I want the people to hear this, and then on the other side, we're going to bring some of our friends to join us, Chris, because I think we're going to have quite a conversation. Estamos conversando con el doctor Chris Washburne, autor de 2 libros, su más reciente, The Latin Jazz, The Other Side. Oigamos El Tema del Apolo, Eddie Palmieri.
El tema del Apolo, para que gocen los Nietzsche.
La importancia, la importancia de nuestra historia y aquellos que escriben nuestra historia es que informan datos de información para cada uno de nosotros que quizás no sabíamos y que explican quizás algunos acontecimientos sociales, culturales y políticos entre grupos étnicos, ¿no? Esta canción, cuando uno empieza a escucharla de una manera diferente, ya que lo escucha como el Apolo siendo el teatro el Apolo, pues entonces uno tiene otra visión de esa confluencia entre latinos, afrocaribeños, afroantillanos y afroamericanos. Así que para mí, este capítulo para mí fue importante. That was a very important chapter for me. Not that the others weren't, but that really opened my eyes to so I said, wow, there's that, like you said, now I understand why that connection to the Palladium was so rich and so strong, and why it made sense, right? If you're a promoter, you know, Max Simon, and you're going to bring people down to the Palladium, yes, people are going to come down from Spanish Harlem and Harlem to the Palladium because they've already at least had that synergy, that connection, which I love. So I'm going to invite some friends to join us, Dr. Washburne, if you don't mind. We have an august group of people I'm going to start off with, and each one will be brought on one by one so I can occupy this whole space. And I don't even know how I'm going to do this because I've never done it before. We're going to start off with another lion, the one and only Bobby Sanabria, who you know for so many years, another product of New England in the sense that he graduated from Berklee College of Music. You've played with him and his band and vice versa. And now he hosts the Latin Cruise on WBGO. So not only is he a cultural warrior, educator, performer, and band director, he's now doing a great job every Friday night on WBGO. Just like that, another dear friend of ours, another dear friend, Ray Vega, who's another one that we all know so well, trumpet player extraordinaire, has played with so many different bands that the list would go on and on and on. He's also an educator in Vermont and does his radio show every Friday night, the Friday Night Jazz program on VPR. And it's such a pleasure to see you and to have you join us, Mr. Ray Vega. And then from Puerto Rico, we've got Jaime Rodriguez, who for many years has been hosting Lo Mejor de Jazz Tropical, the best in tropical jazz, every Sunday on Z93 en San Juan, Puerto Rico. Bueno, mi gente, ahí ustedes ven que tenemos un grupo majestuoso de músicos, como también educadores, radiodifusores que tienen su propia programación. En el caso de Jaime, allá en Puerto Rico, Z93, tiene su programa Lo Mejor del Jazz Tropical. Rey Vega ahora los viernes tiene su programa del jazz el viernes por la noche. Nuestro amigo Bobby Sanabria tiene su programa de jazz el viernes en WBGO, The Latin Cruise, que ya lleva... ¿Cuánto tiempo tú llevas, Bobby, en el programa? ¿Un año y medio?
Un año y medio. A year and a half I've been doing this show. The show's officially titled The Latin Jazz Cruise. It started in 1980 with Irv Roberts, who many of you know as Chico Mendoza, African-American gentleman who led the band Ocho, great pianist and vibes player. And he started the show on BGO in 1980. Then years later, he left, and Alfredo Cruz took the show over and gave it the name The Latin Jazz Cruise, rhyming with his name. Of course, Cruz in our case, C-R-U-I-S-E, in his name's case, C-R-U-Z. And then Abuela Rivera had the show for 26 years. She retired about a year and a half ago. And then the then station manager, Amy Niles, asked me if I would be interested. And I said, let me think about it. I said, I'll only do it if you allow me to educate the audience. And she goes, that's why I'm asking you to do it. So I said yes, and it's been very fruitful. And I wish we had more time, but the payoff of this all is that all of the other announcers on the station draw upon my library to incorporate Latin-oriented jazz on their programs. So sometimes I look at their programs and I start laughing, what they picked out. But it's all good because we need the exposure and the music. We need to get it out there. We're not a footnote. I've always said that. Chris knows that. And I'm so glad that he wrote this book because it's a much needed tome. And if you're looking to, the problem with this music and our culture, like Chris said, everything is looked at in this country as black and white, and we're not part of that equation. Hence, that's why Ken Burns did not have us part of the 18 hours on documentary on jazz. I was expecting a whole hour on the Machito Afro-Cubans. That band one of the greatest big bands and game changing in terms of the history of jazz, just as much as Duke Ellington's band was. Count Basie's big band, etc. So we could talk for more about this, but we have a great guest here. Un saludo cordial, my brother Ray Vega from the Patterson Projects. And I'm from the Melrose Projects, so and you talk about the relationship between blacks and Puerto Ricans in New York. Patterson and Melrose Projects, it's right there.
Yeah. There it is. Ray Vega, nuestro amigo, trompetista extraordinario. Si ustedes quieren conocer a una persona que tiene un sentido de humor, le presento a ustedes a Ray Vega.
Hi guys, how you doing? Yeah, I was doing some stuff on the bottom. Nobody could see what I was doing. Only he could see it. But for those of you who know me on the internet, I was giving him a full dose of Rufus on the bottom. But other than that, it's great to see all you guys. And yeah, it's an interesting topic. And welcome, Jaime. You saw that radio, and here's Jaime.
Here's Jaime. But before we go to Jaime, so Ray, you've been in Vermont for several years now. You're an educator. Years. You continue playing your trumpet, but now you're doing radio on Fridays. How did that come about, Ray?
Well, what happened was the local Vermont Public Radio station, which is under the auspices of National Public Radio, they've had a jazz show on for like 20 years. It was used to be 5 nights a week. Then it went to 1 night a week. And then the host of the show, Reuben Jackson, decided to go back to Washington, D.C., where his family's from. So they needed a host. And they approached me, and I basically told them, I said, yeah, I want to play jazz, but I cannot. I want to play jazz. I want to play a lot of jazz. It's not a Latin jazz show. It's a jazz show.
Right. It's a jazz
show.
It's called the Friday Night Jazz Show.
I mix it up. But I told them, if anybody tells me what I have to play, I won't do the show. Because as a radio person, I'm getting loaded with a lot of music that, I mean, there's Duke Ellington. There is, let's take somebody, a genius of today, somebody like a Billy Childs. And then I got to put something on after that that's not good. I mean, I'm a musician, so I have a discerning ear. I'll say it straight up. And so I can't do it. And out of respect to the art, man, too many people gave up so much of their lives to this art form that there has to be some respect for this music. So, and I'm approaching it as a musician and as an educator. And I just think as we get older, the more I realize that time is of the essence, and that we have limited time to be expending it on the frivolous. So I think we need to focus in on, I will play the Afro-Cuban Jazz Suite of Mario Basa, Charlie Parker, Chico Farrell, and I'll play some new stuff, some bands from the West Coast that are wonderful. But I just want to keep the music. If there's one thing that Jaime disculpa, porque la verdad es que Chris es músico y también Bobby Sanabria. But what Chris and Bobby and I learned from being around people like Tito, and in my case, Tito, my big four were Tito, Ray Barretto, Mario Balsa, and Mongo Santa Maria. And this music deserves the respect, and it deserves the respect that it should get, and it demands it. By the way, footnote, my first gig with Mongo Santa Maria was at the Apollo Theater. Beat it.
Drop the microphone. All right, thank you.
See you later, bye.
Jaime.
Gotta get my teeth.
Jaime, bienvenido también a ti. Jaime es una persona, dama y caballero, que yo respeto y admiro también porque es uno de los guerreros, uno de los leones para con nuestra música. Y cuando digo para con nuestra música, no es solamente la música afroantillana en su totalidad, lo que nosotros conocemos como la salsa o la rumba, lo que sea, sino que él siempre ha tenido un afán, una pasión por ese nicho que se llama el jazz latino, ¿no? El jazz tropical, del cual estaremos hablando. Chris, I want to talk about that. Is it Latin jazz? Is it Afro-Cuban jazz? Is it jazz? Is it what, because there's a lot of people, if you speak to Arturo Sandoval, he'll go one way. If you speak to somebody else, he'll go the other way. If you go to speak to somebody else, they all will give it whatever title they want, but at the end, it is what it is. Jaime siempre ha sido ese tipo de persona que ha tenido un amor y una pasión ya por años. Jaime, ¿cuántos años tú llevas ya en el programa tuyo y antes del programa tuyo? ¿Cuántos años?
I started in 1987 in Clave de Jazz with another guy, con otro muchacho. And in 1991, I start in Z93. It's a radio commercial. It's not public radio, right? And it's difficult to start. And when I start, I've been there from 30 years now. Next year,
30 años.
30
Felicidades. 30 años.
2 hours, now 1 hour, but you know, siempre tengo mucha audiencia, lo oye mucha gente, pero no hay respaldo.
Claro, pero en el caso tuyo, aunque tienes 1 hora, es como un oasis, porque hay muchos músicos, y ahí Catrillo está con nosotros, hay muchos músicos que se han creado en Puerto Rico, en San Juan, y han llegado a los Estados Unidos para continuar sus estudios o su profesión como músico profesional, que cuando hablan sobre sus comienzos y mencionan la radio, no solamente mencionan la radio que toca lo de Tito Rodríguez y lo de Rey Barreto y la Estrella Fania, Roberto Ruena, sino siempre mencionan, mira, hubo un programa o hay un programa, no tenía muchas horas, pero que era el programa donde yo podía escuchar música de jazz y música de jazz latina. Y cuando ellos se refieren a eso, se refieren a ti, Jaime Rodríguez, se refieren a ti en los programas que tú has hecho. Miguel Zenón es uno que siempre habla muy bien de ti, porque él dice que ahí fue como joven que empezó a escuchar mucha de la música de jazz. Así que tú juegas un papel muy importante en la difusión de nuestra música, especialmente el jazz allá en Puerto Rico. Chris, continuando con el tema, continuing. So Ray basically dropped the mic and the fact that his first gig was at the Apollo, but both, Chris, you, all four of you, and if I want to include myself as well, part of our ethos is that it starts off with, this is not music that is just, como decían en español, esto no es Mickey Mouse. In other words, we've always seen this music as deserving its rightful place of respect, right? We've always, all of us who are sitting here, especially you who are the musicians, because you have to go through this day by day by day. What pushback, Chris, have you gotten from those who have read your book, who either A, who agree with you, or B, take a different point of view? What has been the reaction?
Well, I'll answer that in a moment, but I just want to say how honored I am to be sharing the screen with all of you guys. And Ray, I haven't seen you for a long time, but you were so instrumental in so many in my development and welcoming me into the Latin jazz and salsa world. You allowed me to record on your first record, and you recorded one of my songs, which is a big honor. You were my first trumpet player in the SYOTOS band, and I still have never forgiven you for moving to Vermont. Yeah, and I paid more than T. Puente paid at the Apollo. Anyway, but you know, and I've been collaborating with Bobby the same amount of years. I mean, Bobby's giving me incredible. He's welcomed me with open arms into his musical world, and he's played in the SYOTOS band for many years. And Jaime, if you were living in the same city, I'm sure we would have been jamming one way or another too.
Yeah.
I have your CDs. I have.
Thank you so much. Fantastic.
We need the last one.
I will. And but I just want to say that it's interesting because the book is just being, you know, distributed among the musicians, and I'm starting to get more and more feedback. And I'm finding that pushback is really not what I expected it to be. I'm assuming I'm going to get some pushback from very specific musicians very soon that I take to task in this book. But for the most part, for the jazz musicians that are reading it, they're saying, wow, I never realized. Because the history that I write about was not taught to them when they were in music school. They don't have access to this different type of perspective. And the musicians that the Latin jazz musicians, or musicians that spend a lot of time, the professional careers in Latin jazz that write about it, you know, for the most part, they've been extremely appreciative, saying this needs to be said more. This is like, you know, and let's keep going with this. So, and then there's a few musicians that remained extremely quiet. And I mean, and that in some ways, the absence of words speaks louder than those words. And so, it'll be interesting to see how this pans out. But it's also, the words are not what I care about. It's really the actions, right? And how, as we move forward, what other opportunities will be made. I mean, just think about WBGO. Bobby played a huge role in the fight to get more Latin jazz program, because for a while it was just the Latin jazz cruise where you could get regular programming of Latin jazz. And it wasn't until Wilda Rivera herself kind of took over and tried to push more in her regular programming hours. And Ray Barretto played a role in advocating for that. Bobby played a role for that. And a huge shift, a huge programming shift happened, in the sense that they were finally recognizing that the listening public of the greater New York area, there was a huge amount of the population that was interested in listening to Latin jazz, self-identified with the musicians that played it and the cultures from which these rhythms come from. They should be serving them. And I remember right before Wilda retired, I asked her about her perspective on, like, at first it was regulated. You had to have 2 Latin jazz cuts every hour. And it even grew even more. And finally she was like, I'm kind of getting tired. I have to play all this Latin jazz. There's so much other jazz I want to play. And it was almost, it kind of had come full circle. And it was she was saying it, in jest and as a celebration, but there was a huge shift. And as what Bobby just attested to, those other DJs are drawing from your collection, and that you're broadening and expanding that. So this is just in like the public radio sphere, but this has to happen in all of these different spheres where a real shift needs to happen. And we finally have to wake up and think about, like, who are our pop stars today and how did they get there? And the fact that Mark Anthony can have a #1 hit song on top 40 radio that's, it's a guajira or a son groove or a cha-cha groove, and people are like accepting that as popular music. That's a huge cultural shift that's happened over in our lifetimes, and more needs to happen.
It's interesting you mentioned the roles that we play, respectively, 4 of us who do radio. When I played Tanga, the live, that was Symphony Sid introducing the Machito Band live, that they would broadcast on the radio all the time. So and he was not Latino, Symphony Sid was not Latino, and yet you see his name associated during that era with so many bands and so many musicians, and in particular because his role in radio and being able to introduce that music, our music, to a wider and broader audience. I want to jump back to Jaime just before I get to Bobby and to Ray. Jaime, tú dices que tú tienes una hora y que no tiene auspicio. Cuando tú dices eso, auspicio, en el sentido auspiciadores, porque por el otro lado tú tienes una audiencia. Porque mira, como yo había dicho antes, por ejemplo, ¿quién está aquí que puede hablar sobre esto? Tenemos aquí Jimmy Camacho dice: cuando yo estoy en San Juan, yo escucho la Z. Los domingos, lo mejor del jazz tropical, tremendo programa. El programa dura 1 hora y esa hora se va a la milla. Eso dice Jimmy Camacho. O sea, pero sin embargo, tiene una audiencia, pero la administración, aquellos que manejan la emisora, ven el jazz. ¿De qué manera ven el jazz?
Pues parece que lo ven que no es comercial y no se esmeran en venderlo. Yo tuve bastantes años con Henneken, que hacía el festival, auspiciaba el programa y tenía otros auspiciadores, pero llegó el momento en que se acabaron los auspiciadores, me cancelaron el programa, estuve casi 1 año fuera, y cuando regresé con la condición, porque a mí me pagaban y me pagaban muy bien, pero cuando regresé con la condición de que cuando se consiguieran auspiciadores, entonces me pagaban. A la fecha no se han conseguido auspiciadores y yo lo hago.
Tú lo haces de corazón.
Entonces me dieron 1 hora, antes eran 2, me dieron 1, y siempre he estado peleando con el director de programación que me dé, aunque sea media hora más, 1 hora y media, porque tú sabes que los números de Latin Jazz a veces son un poco largos. Tú sabes, a veces hago entrevistas y se me hace un poquito difícil, tú sabes, cuadrar el programa, pero el programa se ha mantenido porque tiene audiencia.
Claro, claro. You know,
Siempre sale arriba los domingos en el horario y no lo quitan, pero no lo venden.
So here's part of the dilemma, Bobby, Ray, and Chris, because you would think an island that is producing just recently the Miguel Senongs, the David Sanchez of the world, William Cepeda, just to name three, and there's so many, many, many more coming out of Puerto Rico who are making their mark in a broader music form, that you would think that they would be received as heroes in the sense that they would have the same level of support from the radio, same level of support from promoters and things of that nature. And Jaime made the point of the Heineken Jazz Festival, which was a very important part of promoting jazz. Talk to us, Bobby and Ray, about the role that those who are watching this show play in our music, Latin jazz, jazz per se. Bobby, you go first. Ray, you second.
Well, generally, well, it's like anything else. The public has to speak up. In terms of Jaime's show only being an hour, that's, man, you really can't do much. But I mean, I can imagine what he does. He probably doesn't talk that much because he wants to get as much music in.
Mm-hmm.
And hopefully the powers that be are watching this right now, and they'll say, wow, maybe we blew it. We should give him an extra at least hour to do his show. But basically what happened at BGO was that the powers that be at the time, and I don't want to say their names, but they decided to take the Latin jazz show off the air.
Mm-hmm.
So I went ballistic. I started writing to people, and this is the power of the internet. We got Congresswoman Nydia Velasquez involved and many other people, well-known musicians, etc. People started writing to the station. I would go to the board meetings, the monthly board meetings, which I never went to, but I heard on the radio once. They had a PSA, a public service announcement. WPGO has a monthly board meeting that anybody is invited. So I show up. When I get there, there's just a lone African-American man with a cane. He's elderly. I said, he goes, hey, young man, I haven't seen you. And I go, oh, sir, nice to meet you. Are you part of the board? He goes, no, I just come here because I'm a widower and I'm, lonely, and I just come, So I see what happens at the board. They sit down, they have coffee and everything, and they talk about what. All of a sudden, the gentleman in charge at the time, I'll say his name, Thurston Briscoe, because it's part of the history. He says he's surprised that I'm there, and I make my pitch to the board, and they're looking at this, and he's saying that they've incorporated Latin jazz into the programming. And I said, yeah, one tune every hour. Are you kidding me, man? He goes, don't you know how many Latinos are in the tri-state area that live and breathe this culture and this music? Do you know how many jazz artists are biting off our culture, et cetera, and are playing our music as basically musical tourists and this, that, and the other? And you don't know the history of our people and this music is concerned. So I would go and forget it. I mean, the letters started coming in through emails, et cetera, and that's how the show came back. And so the power is in the listeners. Find out, if for Jaime, find out who the station manager is, get their email, and start writing to them. So we want
activism.
This program. We want more to hear more of it.
Activism. So Ray, here you go. This is for you, Ray.
Okay.
La Lupe.
¡Vaya! ¡Eso que va! ¡Eso que va! ¡Vaya!
Maricela.
So Ray, I had to play that because
Little Marty Sheller there. Kenny Dorham liked that solo. Kenny Dorham, when he wrote the review in Downbeat magazine, he talked about Marty's solo on that. Kenny Dorham. Okay, so as far as talking about the situation in Puerto Rico, the Puerto Rican. What you tell me what he.
No. Talk to it. Go ahead. It's your open mic. You do what you.
As far as Puerto Rico is concerned, if they were going to have an hour of La Sinfónica de Puerto Rico with música de cámara, de música de Puerto Rico, everybody would be going, no, eso es muy importante. No, eso es nuestra música. Or if they have vamos a tener una hora de música jíbara, they'll be going, no, eso es muy importante. No, eso. But then I would like to mention the names, Ray Barreto, Tito Puente, my man, what do you call that? Hilton Ruiz, Miguel Zenon, all of these great musicians that have their roots coming from Puerto Rico. That's the biggest issue that I have, that our own people don't even really take us seriously. And that bugs me. Yeah, pueden decir, no, ese muchacho es de Nueva York, que no es puertorriqueño. No, los padres míos son de Ponce, ¿ok? Los viejos míos son de Ponce y yo hablo como un boricua. Yo no hablo con una persona extranjera que me diga que soy extranjero, no es un americano. No, la sangre mía es boricua. Yo nací en Nueva York porque la situación estaba mala en Puerto Rico y los viejos míos tenían que sacar y arrancar para Nueva York a buscar trabajo en una factoría. Pues yo me considero boricua para ponerlo fijo. But they got to take us serious. They need to start taking our art serious. And that bleeds my heart. They have a short little festival. I know Perico does a festival in Carolina, but I mean, the music is real and it's sad. What we have to do as far as getting the whole thing about its commerciality. You know what, man? That's for the radio stations to figure that out. Because let me tell you something. If they can take any piece of music by listen, when reggaeton first showed up on the scene, it was something new. People had to go, what? And now they just shove that down everybody's throat, and it's something that everybody wants to listen to. So it's about the power of the internet. Maybe I'm talking more than I should, Bobby. I know I should shut up. Sorry, Chris. Sorry, Hyman.
No.
But it pissed me off, man. I'm sorry I have to use such strong language, but this is just the power of people that are empowering. They should be ashamed of themselves. In radio, whether in Puerto Rico or in the United States, they should be ashamed of themselves. Because if we're going to talk about American music, jazz is American music. We're treating it like it's una porquería de la calle. Okay, we don't listen. Let's face it, folks. We live in America. America does not have a ministry of culture. Countries all over the world. I sat down with the Minister of Culture in Cuba in 2000. Countries, Venezuela has one. Not that I want to, whatever. Ecuador, all of these nations around the world have a ministry of culture. In America, our own culture, man, we just figure it's not important. It's sad. Anyway, other than that, everything's real peaceful. All right.
Just to riff on what Ray said.
Yeah.
When you start to think about the number of Puerto Ricanos, of musicians of Puerto Rican ancestry, and I'm with Ray because my father's from Guanica and my mother's from Yabucoa, and I use the George Carlin rule of thumb, the great comedian. He says, my mother and father are Irish, my grandmother and grandfather on both sides are Irish, my great-grandfather and great-grandmother are Irish on both sides. He goes, nobody's going to tell me I'm not Irish, so nobody's going to tell me that I'm not Puerto Rican. But be that as it may, the amount of Puerto Ricanos that have contributed to the history of what we call Latin jazz, and not just Afro-Cuban rhythms, but we play Brazilian rhythms, we play everything. And now
we play jazz. We play jazz.
And we play jazz too. Yeah, forget it. I mean, so the amount of Puerto Ricans that have been part of the history of jazz and Latin jazz is so great that the powers that be at SETA, if they were socially, politically conscious, they go, wow, we could use this to our advantage to promote not only the musicians, but Puerto Rico as well. So if it's all about money, etc., and green, then they're missing out a golden opportunity. So estamos contigo, Jaime. So la gente lo que tiene que hacer es empezar a escribir a la emisora por correo electrónico.
Yeah.
Chris.
¿Tú sabes qué pasa? Perdón. Que el jazz es una música que muchas personas no le entienden. Entonces, le gusta la música sencilla. Cuando tú le pones este mambo jazz, pues...
Te congelaste, te congelaste.
He froze.
Te congelaste.
Pones un Miguel Zenón que está tocando música boricua, pero en jazz, porque es diferente, es jazz latin, right? No lo entienden. Y entonces, yo creo que es que si la gente no, aquí hay muchos músicos y los músicos les gusta. Y actualmente hay programas en el Conservatorio de Música, hay un programa que Rey Vega estuvo ahí dando charlas y han salido buenos músicos, y en la Interamericana también hay un programa de música popular y jazz, y eso ha cogido mucho auge, pero las emisoras comerciales no le interesa, parece, porque lo que ponen es lo mismo, salsa vieja o salsa nueva y otras emisoras con baladas, pero el jazz no entra, se hace un poco difícil. Por lo menos me he mantenido ahí
No, por eso digo, la gente que estén viendo, sepan que él es uno de los baluartes, defensor de nuestra cultura, y nuestra cultura en un sentido expansivo, no solamente un canal. Hay una pregunta aquí que es interesante también. Chris, can you comment on the parallel history of West Coast Latin jazz's development contribution? Many East Coast musicians relocated to the West Coast. Was this instrumental? Did they have the same hurdles?
Absolutely, they had the same hurdles, and they still have the same hurdles. In the sense that the otherness, in the way that their music is other, is the same as their East Coast brothers and sisters. So we're all in this together. In some ways, my own book explores the music that I write about is typically the music that I play, and so I spend most of my time on the East Coast, and it's much more East Coast centric. But indeed, I was talking to a few of my West Coast musician friends, and they were saying, you really should do a second volume to document what's going on out here and the different types of struggles, because of course it's not just Puerto Ricans. There's a lot of Central Americans that are also participating and out there, and it's inflected in a variety of different ways. And there's a really strong tradition in terms of the Latin rock and the kind of Latin jazz rock that's out there, and as well. And of course, there's some really important innovators, including John Santos and so many other ones that are West Coast centered. So we're all in this together.
No, it is. So I part of the argument that I had hoped that you would all posit is that, on the one hand, I stated to all of you, and I've stated to the public, I purposely wanted this weekend, the first weekend in which in the United States they're celebrating quote unquote Hispanic Heritage Month, to be about this topic matter, right? I wanted this topic matter, specifically Latin jazz, to be the entree to the celebration, in a sense that here's something that many of us celebrate, and there's so many, when you look at your book, and Bobby knows this because he's lived it, Ray's lived it, Chris, you've lived it. When you look at your book and you see the number of names, and your names include folks who are not just the leaders, but just the musicians who play this, who arrange this, who compose this, who are part of this ecosystem of our music, you sit there and that's like a who's who of the all-stars, of the most creative people you can ever come across, right? And you would think that that would be very much part of our everyday celebration, that every single Puerto Rican, Cuban, Dominican, Mario Rivera, I mean, you name it, we should have these people ingrained in our brains and know like that. I remember when I went to Panama the first time with Ruben Blades, and I got to the airport and I told him I was Puerto Rican. The Panamanian people working at the airport knew more about Puerto Rican music than a lot of Puerto Ricans I knew, which blew me away. I said, how is it possible? ¿Cómo es posible que esta gente panameña sepan, igual en Colombia, que saben tanto de nuestra música,
de salsa.
Más que mucha gente en Puerto Rico? Entonces, cuando viene a eso, yo pienso que el papel que juega un Bobby, un Rey, tu libro, yo creo que va a ser muy importante en educar y ser parte de la información que yo voy a difundir, como también ya Bobby sabe mucho de eso, Ray knows a lot. El Mismo Jaime, your book is going to be a source of so much information, Chris. That's why I'm so excited for you, in particular, and why this came out at the right time. But part of the reason that is such a source is because you did your homework, right? You give thanks to Chris, you give, I mean, to Bobby, you give thanks to Ray. The list of people you acknowledge in the beginning is a chapter of all that. So I'm sharing this thought with you because I think that we need to be much more purposeful in trying to expand this ecosystem and give this ecosystem its rightful place in society, not only here in the United States, which is a struggle, but in our own homeland, right? In our own homeland. Ray, you've been to Cuba. Bobby, you've been to Cuba as well, right? How many times have you been to Cuba already?
Twice.
One time.
And I've taught and I've lectured and taught there in Cuba too. So about what the history of what Cuban music, how it evolved in New York City, so it's an amazing thing. They don't know anything about what happened in New York City. But then again, there are many young musicians coming up that don't know what happened, has happened. Part of this, the problem is lack of education, and me and Ray have been in the forefront as well as Chris in getting our voices heard through this. I mean, at times having to like freaking scream with academia, and also with my brethren in the jazz world, saying to because they have this. The problem is that the people that have written jazz history have written it from a skewed, myopic perspective that I would say is a perspective of indifference and racism. Nobody likes to use that word, indifference. I get it. And cultural insensitivity. And I say it all the time. Hey, how come they don't mention this? People ask me, how come they don't mention this? How come I didn't learn this in jazz history when I took jazz history 10 years ago at Rutgers or whatever? I go, because they don't give a damn about us, man. They look at us like a footnote. If you see Mario Balzan in any jazz textbook, I'd be surprised. All they mention is Dizzy Gillespie and Chano Pozo. And I go, man, what about Augusto Cohen? He had the first Latin big band in New York City. He was Puerto Rican in the 1930s. And of course, Machito and the Afro-Cubans. I mean, it's like ridiculous. And then for me and Ray, it really hurts because Ray mentioned Puente, Machito, who else?
Mongo. Ray.
We Ray Barreto, we've all played with him, with all those people. So we've lived and breathed this. I've been very fortunate. Ray's would agree with me. We've been very privileged to have basically played and recorded with the people that developed this music, Mario Balzan. And we could sit here for hours telling you stories about Mario Balzan, both funny and sad. But the problem is indifference, cultural insensitivity, and racism. And that extends all across the board in the world of jazz. And that's why Chris's book is going to shock a lot of people into like going back and go, wow, man, maybe I should have made fun of like Latin music the way I do, or like, maybe when I write a chart and I shouldn't put on the top just Latin. When I see somebody write an arrangement and they put Latin on the top, I look at them and I go, what do you want, man? What is it? A cha-cha-cha, a samba, a bossa nova, a Brazilian maracatu? What is it? He goes, well, man, it's Latin. I go, Latin, man, I took Latin in my first year in high school. What are you talking about, man? So this kind of indifference, and I call it musical tourism. It's very disrespectful to us, culturally as well as musically. Chris's book, hopefully, is the beginning of that starting to change in our world. My students, Ray's students, Chris's students, they're part of the converted because they've had the opportunity to study with us. But not everybody gets to study with us. Not everybody gets to encounter John Santos on the West Coast, or et cetera, or Socrates Garcia, who is an expert in Dominican music, et cetera, et cetera. So we need more education in terms of the college level, not just somebody starting a course at some college in the Midwest and it says Latin jazz and they've never played this music before, or they've learned it just from a book. People that really know this music know the culture, because there's two aspects. There's the technical aspect,
Mm-hmm.
and then there's the cultural aspect.
Mm-hmm.
And I can tell you right away, I can tell anybody that I can tell right away from listening to somebody whether they know the culture of the music or not. Why? Because when they improvise, that's when you get a chance to speak in the language. And I can tell right away, this person, you know, learned how to play this music on the drums from buying a book.
Mm-hmm.
You know?
Mm-hmm.
And I hate to sound like so angry or whatever.
No, you don't sound angry. You're advocating. You're passionate. Chris, I have a question for you, but I want to welcome Arturo Gomez.
Vaya!
Mira para allá. Ahora tenemos Arturito. Arturito.
Another Bronxite.
Hey, good afternoon, everyone.
It's good to see you, my friend.
Hey,
Thank you
thanks
for joining.
for having me and participate in this. And before I get started, Chris, fantastic, your latest book, and it's just a wonderful addition to my library. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Arto. That means a lot. You've been such a great supporter over the years and such an important figure in this music. Really one of the most important advocates we have, and I'm grateful for that. Thank you.
Well, I always remembered your explanation of SYOS before you had to go through your ordeal, and I'm so happy to see you on the other side.
Yeah, me too.
So before I ask you a question, Arturo, and I ask you a question, Chris, that has to do with the topic matter, why don't you explain to people the SYOTS?
Well, you know, when I was playing in the salsa bands in the late 80s, so many of my colleagues sitting next to me in the horn section and the band were also really good jazz players, Ray Vega in particular. And I thought I should really start my own band, and because I had a love for jazz as well, and kind of bring together all of the salsa experience we had and also bring all our jazz experiences together. And so I started it, and I had no idea what to call the band. I think originally it was like, you know, the Latin Jazz Project or something. Who knows? And but then I within a year I was diagnosed with a very serious skin cancer on my face, and I was told that I had to have emergency surgery and I'd never be able to play trombone again. But I also may not survive that battle. And but we had one gig like booked the next week. It was for Bastille Day. I remember at this French restaurant, and I said to the doctors, "Can we put off the surgery until at least I can play my last gig?" And I remember it was a very difficult gig for me because I thought I was never going to play again, let alone I didn't know what my future was. And right in the midst of that gig, while I was playing, the phrase, I looked at my bandmates and I just thought to myself, I'll see you guys on the other side. And I started calling to see you on the other side again in a band. And they were looking at me like, what are you talking about? And then I just shortened it to the acronym SYOTOS and coined that phrase. And after I you know, thank God I survived that ordeal and was able to come back and play again. And actually, Ray Vega was one of the first people to give me a gig back after I went through that ordeal. We played it. I think it was at Lehman or Hostess. I can't remember which one it was. With your
Peter
last.
Conde, remember Peter Conde, man.
And Pito Conde was also someone who saved my gig. That's right, and let me play back. And it was Ray Vega and Pito Conde Rodriguez that allowed me to come back and like work on my chops because I wasn't able to. I didn't have the same chops when I first started coming back, but I was always grateful for that. And so that name stuck. I wanted to pay tribute to that. And it wasn't until just a few years ago when you'd Google SYOTOS, only my name would come up. And then about 4 years ago, I Googled it, and the group Korn came up, and they had the SYOTOS tour. And I'm like, they stole the name. I didn't know. Everybody's like, well, didn't you like copyright it or register it or what? And like or trademark it? I'm like, no. And I'm like, you know, if it was like Zeppelin, that would be cool. But Korn, anyway. but Korn was so popular amongst the military that the SYOTOS became it entered into the Urban Dictionary as a word. So I'm like, damn, I'm just like Shakespeare. I'm creating the words, or George Bush, I don't know. And I looked at the definition of it, and it said military jargon, as in house, see you on the other side. And they had all of these military vehicles with SYOTOS written on the side of them from Iraq. I was really like, I guess that was my contribution to the war effort. Who knows? But
I
So much
got
for
you. Well,
trademarks.
but we're happy that we saw you on the other side and that you are on the
On
other
the other
side.
side. Thank
So,
you so much.
Arturo, saludo a ti, bienvenido.
Thank you,
Habla-
gracias.
Hablando sobre este tema, so talking about this subject matter, you're in Denver, Colorado. So you're not on the West Coast, you're not in the Bay Area, you're not in the East Coast, you're not in Chicago, you're not in Miami. Denver, Colorado, jazz, but then Latin is very much part of the programming that takes place in Denver, Colorado. We need to dive into how it is that we're able to do such a job as to bring that on board. But before you start, hold on. I think there's something here in the background that you may want to just touch on. I have a feeling there's, here you go. So
Another Bronx side, Stan Getz.
I thought I would drop a little. I thought I'd drop a little bit of that because there's also a thought when we think about jazz, Latin jazz. We always have that thought it is Afro-Cuban in essence, right? Without thinking about the Brazilian connection, and I think it's an important aspect of this music that is so rich. And you speak about that, Chris, in your book. So before Arturo answers the question as to Denver, Colorado, embracing our music the way it has, touch a little bit about that case study that you present to us in your book as far as the Safinado and jazz samba.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is that originally there was not a term called Latin jazz, right? When the music starts to emerge as something that's slightly different, oftentimes it's the rhythms that are identified on the record labels as to which dance was associated with that.
Mm-hmm.
And we don't really get the word Latin jazz used with any regularity until the 1960s. But a lot had happened previous to that. And it was really the high profile of Dizzy Gillespie. Like, he was one of the big bebop stars, right? He played with Charlie Parker. He was on the verge of a revolution in the music. You know, he was one of the people that caused the naming game to really take off. And for him, it was about marketing, to try to differentiate jazz from the 1930s to the 1940s. They called it bebop. It was successful marketing as something new. He called his kind of mixing with of Latin Cuban music specifically with jazz Cubop, like the first two letters of Cuba and bop to mix with bebop, and it started to progress from there. And indeed, it affected a lot of different types of jazz, where people were trying to rename it over and over again. Every few years, there would be the new and improved version. And it helped for the marketing of that. And then also with Mario Bazan Machita calling their band the Afro-Cubans, that idea of Afro-Cuban jazz kind of stuck. But of course, as soon as you have musicians starting to play Brazilian music, Afro-Cuban jazz doesn't work anymore.
Right.
And it's one of the reasons why Latin jazz started to stick more and was used more often, because it started to acknowledge kind of a wider range of influences that were being brought in. A lot of musicians still kind of push back against this. I was talking to Miguel Zenon fairly recently, and he was saying he doesn't like to use the word Latin jazz because, people associate it with that Afro-Cuban inflected music. And so what do you call it? And of course, Arturo Alfaro had the same problem to contend with when he started the band at Lincoln Center. Do you call it an Afro-Cuban big band? Which basically the music, when they first started playing, it was basically Afro-Cuban jazz that they were playing. They decided to choose Afro-Latin instead. So the game of genre labeling it's a game, and it's always going to erase certain contingencies. It's going to include others, and it's very complicated. And it's something that a lot of people don't really talk about. But it makes a huge difference in a musician's career, because if you get posited as a Latin jazz musician, you're going to have a certain type of opportunities, and you're going to be barred from other opportunities. Miguel Zenon, for instance, he calls his music jazz, whether he's playing Puerto Rican inflected jazz or not, because strategically for him, it serves him well to be aligned within the jazz community. And I think, both Ray Vega was influential in my thinking about that, about what he called his music. Tito Puente, how he called his music, was influential, kind of pushing back against the term salsa as a marketing label. And Bobby as well. Bobby has, over his career, and I've been playing with Bobby for close to 30 years. Over the course of his career, he changes it and inflects it in a variety of different ways that are really pushing it back against all of these forces. I think that the most recent iteration for Bobby's band, and he can speak more about that, is the multiverse, right? Talking about the diversity that actually goes into that music. But the thing with getting back to Desafinado is that it changed this naming. But this was made by Charlie Berg on guitar and Stan Getz on saxophone, two big jazz stars, right? So when they put this record out, it sold more records and was charting higher than any other jazz tune up to that moment. And it caused a real quandary, because that was precisely at the moment where, how do you define jazz? If it becomes extremely popular, is it still jazz, or is it something else? And so we start to see this being called jazz. We see it being called bossa nova. We see it being called Brazilian jazz. We see it being called Latin jazz. And nobody really kind of can agree what it should be called, because it's got all of these different contingencies. So it's a very interesting moment in the history, the evolution of this music, and really kind of opens up the window to what the problem is when you start to name music. Because as soon as you name music, any musician's going to resist. When you label them, all of a sudden you're putting this in a box. And you're defining them. It's not the reality of what we actually do and how we play.
No, that's a great.
I could give you an example of a musician that suffered because of being associated with language. Somebody has their microphone on or something.
Somebody needs to put headsets. Who doesn't have a headset on or earplugs in the ear? Because we're hearing the. You have earplugs, Arturo? You got some earplugs on?
No, I don't do very well with buds, but I can assure you my apartment is completely silent at the time. There's no external sounds. I have no pets.
Okay, no.
Anyway,
okay.
Real quick, a musician that suffered because he became associated with the music was Cal Tjader. Cal Tjader was very much entrenched in the world and very well respected as a legitimate, I hate to use that word, but for lack of a better term, legitimate, straight-ahead jazz musician. And he recorded many tracks, many albums playing straight-ahead jazz. Once he became associated with Afro-Cuban jazz and then later on Brazilian jazz in the 60s, the jazz world turned their back on him, because in the beginning of his career, he would show up always in the top category for vibes in downbeat. Once he became associated just with Latin-oriented jazz, he disappeared. So that's an example how labeling can sometimes. And Cal Tjader's a tremendous jazz musician. I mean, he's a legitimate jazz musician. But because he fell in love with that style of music and promoted it and played it, he suffered.
Yeah, and this goes on over and over again. For instance, Donna Aspiazu in the Savannah Casino Orchestra, they're the ones that had the Peanut Venner in 1930. You know, in the aftermath of the success of that recording, he landed a gig at the Rainbow Room, and the Rainbow Room was one of the highest paid gigs in New York City, and he was hired to play Latin music, and there was a jazz band that was hired to play jazz music. And what happened is that he would always throw in jazz tunes because they were all jazz musicians. They played jazz in Havana. And every time they would do that, the management would come up and say, don't play jazz. We only hired you to play rumba and to play different Latin in boleros and things. And Don Aspiazu said, well, we play jazz. And they would say, the response was, nobody in the United States wants to hear a Cuban band play jazz. He eventually got fired. He lost that job. And it was interesting, in the 1990s, Mauricio Smith, the Panamanian flautist, was hired to play at the Rainbow Room. They were the Latin band. I would sub for them every once in a while. And Mauricio was also a really good jazz musician. And he would put in jazz tunes every once in a while. And in the 1990s, he got the same pushback because there was a swing band that was supposed to play the swing stuff and he was supposed to play the Latin stuff. And in the end, they got fired. And it was like the same fight was happening 60 years later. And for the same kind of the same logics that was here. And there was no progress being made.
Right. Can I
identity politics. Go ahead, Ray.
Go ahead, Ray.
Okay, check this out. Several years ago, I'm not going to name names. It doesn't matter. Several years ago, I was playing jazz at the Bistro in St. Louis with my band. Now, there's a booking agent that's based in Columbia, Missouri, who books several top-level jazz musicians whose names I won't mention. So he asked me to go play with my group. A group is Zakai Curtis and Chembo and great band. So we go to Columbia, Missouri to go play our gig. Now, when I do my gig, I'll play my stuff and then I might throw in like a standard in the swing style. And the cat told me, the booking agent who happens to manage some jazz musicians who are making money playing Latinized music, he came to me and told me, you can't play that. And I told him, well, do you tell your artist that he can't play Latin music on his gig? Because where are you coming up with this stuff? Yo le dije que dijera ligerito a ese tipo. He comes up to me and he tells me, well, so anybody can figure out who I'm talking about if they do their homework in Columbia, Missouri, which I really don't care because it don't matter. I got a gig. You know what I'm saying? I got a gig. I don't need. But it was insulting to me. How are you going to tell me that I don't have the right to play something from the Great American Songbook with my band? How you tell me that? But you're going to tell me, no, you got to play all Latin because my last name is Vega. I mean, don't is good, and yet he books artists that are jazz musicians and that put out their fringe recordings of Latin music and get picked up and can say, "Oh, these are the great jazz guys doing Latin music." And when they switch it around, so yeah, this still alive today. You know, it's still there, but the jazz, the powers of being jazz don't want to admit it. They don't want it.
And I tell you, in terms of the history of the music, for example, I get interviewed and they ask me, who are the drummers that influenced you? And I go, the drummers, not congueros, timbaleros. I got people
they want
trap
set.
set. Just specifically the drum set, which is the instrument that I'm known for as well as the timbales. So I say, well, Willie Bobo. And I go, no, I asked you jazz drummers. I go, Willie Bobo's a jazz drummer. And he goes, no, he's not. He's a timbale player. I go, obviously, you don't know his history. You never heard the Inventions and Dimensions album by Herbie Hancock? Where Willie's playing. Everybody thought everybody thought it was Philly Joe Jones when that record came out. I've heard that from Reggie Workman. Great. Yeah, everybody thought that was Philly Joe, man. Everybody was going, yeah, it's Willie. So that's just a small example. When the Smithsonian traveling exhibit on Latin jazz happened, they had a section on the percussionist. So I got mad because I told him, why did you just put that Willie Bobo just play timbales on his description? You're being myopic in terms of his influence as a musician, and you're doing not only a disservice to the history of the music, but a disservice to him. He was much more than just a timbale player. He played the hell out of bongo. He was a great conga player, and he was a hell of a jazz drummer. That's very important for people to know that. And he goes, oh, we didn't have enough space, or, always some jive excuse. So, I mean, anyway, these are the kind of hurdles that we go through, and this is why Chris's book is so important.
No, it is, and I will reiterate what I've been telling the public. Esta persona que tenemos hoy aquí conmigo son leones. Los leones no de Ponce, sino los leones en la guerra, en la cual son leones en la cual estamos diciendo nuestra historia en nuestras palabras. O sea, no se puede permitir que otra persona cuente nuestra historia, porque si lo hacemos así, entonces nuestra historia nunca se cuenta. Nunca se cuenta. Jamás se va a contar. Jamás se va a contar.
José, con permiso,
Dime,
un ejemplo de lo que está hablando Bobby. Bobby está hablando de Willy Bobo, ¿verdad? Drummer. Dave Brubeck tenía a Carl Jader tocando drums y bongo antes. O sea, él empezó ahí con Dave Brubeck y tocando drums. Y él toca percusión, bongo, campana. Lo que pasa es que después la gente lo conoció por el vibráfono, porque se quedaba ahí, pero siempre tocaba la percusión, la campana. Cuando Mongo estaba en la conga, tú sabes.
Era percusionista.
Y otra cosa, cambiando el tema de lo que estaban hablando de la música de jazz. Fíjense que Watermelon Man dio un montón de copias, ¿verdad? Eso fue un hit en el Billboard, en todo eso, ¿verdad? Pero ¿por qué fue que fue? Es que una canción bien sencilla, es como un bugalú, ¿sabes? Un soportuno, ¿verdad? Y igual que Desafinado, que salió, pues eso fue un boom porque fue un bossa nova, algo de los Estados Unidos. Y eso ayudó a que se expandiera el Latin jazz, tú sabes. Pero Mongo, y fíjate que Mongo también tuvo una época que lo que hacía era grabando música soul.
That's right.
Sí, un montón. Yo tengo como 10 discos, Feeling All Right. Yeah, he just did a whole,
Atlantic, yeah.
Pero parece que era que vendían, esos discos vendían. Parece que gustaban mucho en general al público, porque son más comerciales.
Exacto.
Esa es la diferencia, yo creo.
We always have these little periods like what Jaime is talking about when Mongo Santamaria was signed to Atlantic Records, and they wanted to capitalize on the previous history he had with Watermelon Man, and he started doing covers of like songs by the Temptations, James Brown, etc. So I mean that Chris can address that more in terms of the pressures put on jazz musicians sometimes to make a compromise so that they can get to a wider audience. And then we have always some little breakthroughs, like for example, Carlos Santana recording Oye Como Va. I mean, that brought the hippie generation into the fold in terms of hearing the percussion instruments that we use in Afro-Cuban music. And for some of those hippies, they go, hey, wait a minute, that sounds like the music my mother and father used to dance to when I was a little kid. So Chris can address that. Maybe he can talk about that right now, about some of the compromises we have to make sometimes as musicians.
Chris, open mic to you. The word is that maybe in your book you touched on the fact that there's some pressures that make it so that the musicians, Latino musicians in particular, have to follow. Ray Barretto would say that all the time, right? Ray Barretto was like, he wanted to play jazz, and he saw himself always as a jazz artist. He did not see himself as a Latin jazz artist. Your dear friend Jose Cruz writes, Jose Cruz writes that piece where he spent time with Ray, and there was an argument all night long about Latin jazz, and Ray kept saying there is no such thing as Latin jazz, there is no such thing as Latin jazz, and the night was finished, and finally, Ray says, you got that right, there's no such thing as Latin jazz. And so Ray was adamant about that it was jazz, and he felt pressure whenever they wanted him to move out of that and play something very different, or what they thought was commercial. Touch on that. Yeah, go ahead.
The last album of Barretto is jazz, the last one. The last one is jazz with Latin musicians. The last one.
Oh, yeah. It's all jazz.
Right, Bobby?
Yes, it's a straight ahead album. Yeah. He's just playing congas too. That's all.
That's right. I mean, with Ray is a interesting case in the sense that, every time that I would speak to him, he said, in reality, I'm just a frustrated drummer. And, he played congas and he's known as a conga player, but he also really wanted to play drums. And he used to come on Thursday nights down at the New Eurekan Poets Cafe where we had a jam session for like a year straight.
Yeah.
And he would hang out in the bar and he'd sit and hang out. And every once in a while he'd come up and say, Chris, can I sit in? And it was never on congas. Yep. It was always on traps.
Yeah.
And every time he played, he goes, and don't play any Latin rhythms. I just want to play swing. And we would play a standard for him while he would just be swinging at like a medium tempo, and he would just be in heaven. And, I had the opportunity to interview him a number of times for this book. And I also played, thanks to Ray, actually. Ray got me into his band, and I would sub in Ray's Ray Barreto's salsa band. And I even subbed once in a Latin jazz band. And Ray Vega got me in for that. But he always just said, every year he would get this week at the Blue Note.
Mm-hmm.
He would beg them every year not to put him on the Latin Jazz Week. He wanted to be opposite Johnny Griffin or McCoy Tyner or some other big jazz star, so to be viewed as equal to them. And instead, they would put him on a week where he'd alternate with Pancho Sanchez or Eddie Palmieri. And so, again, like relegated to this 1 week or 2 weeks that the Blue Note would reserve for the Latin Jazz Week throughout that. And for Ray, it was a huge fight because if we think about his history, he's really the first conga player to really swing on the congas. And, some of the recording he did with Red Garland, Manteca, is quite extraordinary, where he's actually able to work with Art Taylor and really integrate from a jazz perspective. And so he was a jazz musician, and he approached Latin music with a jazz aesthetic. You can even look at his salsa band.
Yeah.
That was the jazziest salsa band that was out when they were playing, because it was his personal aesthetic. And getting back to what Bobby said, there's huge pressure. I remember the very first record deal that I was negotiating with Jazz Heads Record, a small independent record label that Bobby's on now in New York. The first conversation I had was, do you have a cut on that record that sounds like Watermelon Man?
Huh.
In other words, repeat that success, and that's all we need. Just one hit, and you can record anything you want, but we need you to do that. And this was just a small independent label that was really giving me like full artistic control. But that's the model that they had, and set off by Mongo's success. But the thing is Mongo was so successful with that record outsold Desafinado. And that became even more popular on a more diverse of charts. So they were on like the soul charts, the R&B charts, all sorts of things. And no one knew what to call that cut and all of that success that he was having. Was he a jazz artist? Was he Latin jazz? Was it Afro-Cuban jazz? What do you call it? And it was a real quandary. And when you read jazz histories, Desafinado, The Peanut Vendor, and also Mongo's Watermelon Man outsold everything else that came around it at that time. They were the number one best-selling jazz records of their time. And these records oftentimes do not appear in jazz histories. They're just written out, or they're footnotes, or they're just one paragraph. And here it is, like the biggest selling record that kind of rejuvenates jazz in a variety of different ways. And why is it? Why are those written out? Well, first of all, they're too popular, and second of all, they've got influences from the Caribbean and other places that are not from the United States. And third of all, some of them, the band leaders, Mongo Santa Maria is an Afro-Cuban man. So it's super problematic to fit in with how we just started this discussion, this black and white nation that we live into, because there's no space for the brown, beige, and mulatto. And in terms of the music making, in terms of those folks. But if you look at the history of jazz, what Bobby was suggesting, and also Ray, was there were a huge number of Puerto Ricans, Cubans, Latin Americans, Central Americans that were participating in early jazz, and also were seminal in the development of jazz in New Orleans.
For sure.
And that's cultural specificity is just not recognized.
It isn't. So I have a request here. Arturo, speak. Arturo,
Yes,
you've
please.
been quietly. Arturo, you've been
Habla,
quiet.
Arturo.
You've been
Well,
quietly
I don't
listening.
want to interrupt
No,
anybody.
no,
I
no,
was waiting for you to invite me to
no,
speak
no, no,
about
no.
this.
You've
That's
been
gonna be the name of a tune.
yeah, Arturo, speak.
Arturo, habla.
Okay, well, here we
Habla,
go
tío.
then.
It'll be like when Sammy walked in. So
Yeah,
Arturo,
yeah,
speak.
yeah. With
Sammy
Sammy
walks in, I
Figueroa,
love that. Okay, well, here it is. You asked me about how is it that, Latin jazz and salsa using the, the
Yes.
label.
Yeah.
Music has way too many labels,
Right.
not just on the Latin side, but in every side of the music. And it really hurts more than it helps. It's done for marketing purposes. So when people go buy music in the store, just like salsa was invented for that, rock and roll and all those other terms that they use are invented for categorization in record stores. Now, I just want to say, unlike my very esteemed colleagues on this panel, I am not a musician. I am strictly a lifelong music lover, record collector, and I've been working in radio my second career since 1988. And that's my specialty. And I consider myself kind of an archivist and a semi-historian, not to the degree of a Chris or something that has published books and has earned degrees as an ethnomusicologist. But, just from experience of being on this planet for 67 years and living in the Bronx till I was 13 years old, hearing a wide array of music. And then after I moved away to the West Coast, Los Angeles, every summer, the first time, as soon as school was out, my parents would send me back to spend the summer with my cousins in the Bronx because I hated being out there in the country. And I was so out of place being insulted for the way I talked, which back then I spoke a little bit different before entering radio, and for the words and terms that I used for like calling the hydrant the Johnny Pump. They thought I was crazy. They thought I was a Martian out there. But anyhow, what happened in Denver that created the scene that is so flourishing now is that in 1960, a Puerto Rican percussionist from Brooklyn who was close friends with Louis Ramirez, a fellow who just recently retired named Raymond Pacheco, we call him Papi Pacheco. He moved out here after he served in the army and was stationed out here. He fell in love with a Mexican lady, he married, and he stayed here. He was the first person to bring percussion to the music of Denver back then. Jazz has always flourished in Denver because of its location. It was an area of Denver called the Five Points, which was the Harlem of the Rocky Mountains. It was a place between Chicago, St. Louis, and the West Coast. So it was a great touring area, and all the jazz musicians would come through the Five Points and play. We also gave two great jazz musicians to the world. One was called the Vice Prez, tenor saxophonist Paul Quinochet, and the Little Prez, a tenor saxophonist named Phil Urso. They were from Denver, and they were considered great jazz musicians. Then after the 60s, when the Latin tinge started to take hold because of fellows like Ray Pacheco and a couple others that followed, KUVO Jazz Station that I worked for was founded in 1985 by Latinos. And a few months after it was founded by Latinos, the program director, who is still at the station as now the general manager, Carlos Lando Cartagena, a Puerto Rican, came, and he established the tradition of including Latin jazz and Brazilian jazz, not as a specialty show once a week, but as part of everyday on-air programming. Every on-air host since 1985 on Kuvo Jazz is required once an hour or two an hour to play some kind of Latin jazz in all of the varieties, or Brazilian jazz. So people listeners now are aware of this music and have grown to like it, and it become successful. And Kubo Jazz, since my arrival in 2003, has added a little extra, momentum to that. And as Bobby might know, we brought out Candido Camero out here when DVD, The Cuban Fire or whatever, Hands of Fire. I can't remember the exact name of that
That's
DVD.
it, Hands of Fire, yeah.
Hands of Fire. We brought him out here and presented that documentary, and it was a sellout crowd. And then he related the story that he was out here in 1961 playing with the Stan Kenton Band. And so there's always been a presence of Latin jazz here in Denver, and in the last 5 years, in Denver, we've become more cosmopolitan. There's much more of a Caribbean presence in greater Denver now than there was before. In my 13 years here, I've seen it where it has become much more diverse. There's always been a Puerto Rican community. Why? Because anywhere there's an army or military base, there's going to be Puerto Ricans. Everybody knows that. Although I am Cuban American, I grew up in a Puerto Rican atmosphere, and two of my older mother's brothers, my two uncles, both married Puerto Ricans. So I have Cuban Rican cousins, and in the holidays, I had the best of both worlds because we would have both Cuban food and Puerto Rican food for the holidays. So I'm very connected here in the Puerto Rican community. I'm one of the organizers of the annual Taste of Puerto Rico Festival, which is the largest gatherings of not only Puerto Ricans, but of Cubans, because wherever there's Puerto Ricans, Cubans are going to come in. Same, it works vice versa, like in Miami, where obviously the majority is Cuban, where I moved from here in 2003. So actually, I've been here 17 years. Oh my goodness, I'm getting old. But anyhow, so that's the philosophy of Cubo Jazz that has helped shape the flavor of Denver as far as Latin music, because of it being constantly on the air since its inception. And no disrespect to Bobby, because it has nothing to do with him, but WBGO until and still kind of until recently, the birthplace of Latin jazz, because it wasn't born in San Juan or Havana. Latin jazz was born in New York, and until recently, they never incorporated Latin jazz into their programs except as a specialty show when it was Chico Alvarez, then Aguilda Rivera, and now Bobby. But I do understand that finally into their hourly mix throughout the week, they're incorporating a bit more Latin jazz than they ever had. And that's a good thing. Chuy Varela and KCSM in San Mateo, the Bay Area of San Francisco, they have a similar philosophy to incorporate Latin jazz. We don't need to be put in the back of the bus as a specialty show. Jazz, you cannot have jazz without the Spanish tinge from the very beginning, which is why Ken Burns' jazz, and may he rest in peace, Stanley Crouch, I criticize because they didn't address that. They didn't address the Afro-Cuban or Cubop jazz elements in the 1940s in their Burns jazz series. How could you go through jazz history and ignore that? It boggles my mind. It's like exploring the history of the United States and not include the Civil War. You can't. No,
you're right. You're right. You're right.
I must say, though, in defense of Stanley, when he would see me, he was very nice to me, and he would ask me. He would ask me about Mario Bazar. I wish I would have gotten to know him better, because I was we spoke and he was going, really? Wow. Yeah. So maybe if we would have gotten to speak more, I could have enlightened him more, but may he rest in power and peace.
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely.
Hey, Bobby. I'm looking
Bobby
at the
Sanabria.
Yeah, go ahead, Ray.
Stanley Crouch was cool with you because he knew you were from the projects. He didn't want you to kick his butt. That's what happened with that. Okay. Now, let me just say one thing. I teach jazz history at the University of Vermont. And when it comes to this segment that I have to talk about the development of these sounds, I use a particular textbook, but there's nothing there enough for me to talk about. So I created all of my own information with videos and all this stuff, and I give it to the students. And I always tell them, it ain't in the textbook. You're gonna have to look at my sheets that I give out. I do a PowerPoint thing. I said because the books ain't there until Chris decided to do that.
Yeah.
But your book
That's
is
what
not
I'm saying.
really, is it a
No,
textbook or is
this
it more?
it's a seminal piece. And time out before we continue. I'm looking at the clock. It says we've been on for 2 hours and 27 minutes. In 3 minutes, Facebook or YouTube, most likely Facebook is gonna all of a sudden drop us because they usually do at 2 hours and 30 minutes. So
I'm sorry.
No, Chris, I want you to end this in whatever time. And audience, if we get cut off, I'm gonna ask these gentlemen if they wouldn't mind on another date in the future. All of them who are here, just start from the beginning and do a 2.5 hour just symposium, and we'll talk before so we get at least buckets of what it is that we want to talk about. There was a great question, really Bruno. How about Mongo's Afro Blue that crossed over from Afro Cuban to straight ahead jazz with John Coltrane? That alone is worth at least 20 minutes of discussion. But
well, first of all, the company didn't give Mongo credit. They put out that John Coltrane wrote the piece. And Jack Hook, to his credit, wrote a big letter to Prestige Records, I think it was, and then they had to give him an apology. I remember that letter because Mongo showed me the apology letter when I played with him. We used to hang out all the time, have lunch, and et cetera, et cetera. But that's, there are certain tunes that have become part of the canon of jazz. One of them is El Manicero. Every New Orleans musician knows El Manicero. Not all of them know the name of the song because when I was in New Orleans, they started playing it, and I go, hey, it's great that you know the El Manicero. They go to me, is that what the name of that song is?
So, gentlemen, two things. One, Chris, I want you to have the last word. Gentlemen, I want to thank all of you, and I'm going to ask if you would indulge me in a future date that we can coordinate where all 5 of you join me again to do this kind of conversation. If you're open for that, we will continue part 2, Latin jazz, the other jazz, using Chris's book as the base of conversation. And if you say yes, I'll coordinate that. Chris, you got the last word, my friend.
Let's do it, because this is just the beginning of a conversation, and it's a long overdue. And I just want to thank everybody here. All of you have such important voices and have been great influences in my own life and great inspirations. And just keep on keeping the faith, and keep this music spreading around the world. It's the most beautiful music in the world.
Well, I want to thank each and every one of you. Arturo, next time I expect you to join us at 4:00, so that way we can get your rich history as well, my brother, because you've got a lot to share with us, and something that I think people will respond to. Let me just share this one note. It says, "Gracias, Don Jose, and to our lions who roared for us today." Our lions who roared for us today. Looking forward to the next one. Don Washburne, thank you for passing on our glorious history to the next generation of lions. Much respect. So I think the idea that you are lions, that's what I think of you. I think of you as lions. You're a pride of lions. You are the ones who are telling and speaking truth to power, but you're telling our story, which is deserving of being told in our own voices. And for that is the reason I invited you. I have so much admiration for each one of you, so much respect for each one of you, so much love because I know you. And I'm just thrilled that you gave me this opportunity to share this time with you. So I thank each and every one. Ray, I look forward to seeing you again. Jaime, ya tú sabes.
It's a pleasure.
Hay la parte 2, Arturo, parte 2. Bobby,
Count on me.
tenemos la parte 2.
Seguro.
Chris, part 2. And next, in the next one, I want to touch on some of the lions as far as music.
Sabor y dulzura con mucha cadencia, paga del bailador.
Anthony Almonte cantando y tocando conga.
Yeah.
Tremendo.
So we'll have an
Carlos
opportunity.
Enriquez, Bronx Strong.
Anyway, I love you all. Thank you again, Chris. You've made it.
Well,
I appreciate
thank
you.
you
very much.
All right. And don't forget, ladies and gentlemen, this is the book right there. The one that you all want to get on your bookshelf quickly, the Latin Jazz. So that way, next time we have the show, you'll be able to lean in with your questions and your thoughts from reading the book, Latin Jazz. I want to thank each and every one of you for participating. Again, God bless you. Thank you. Mucho H. Se le quiere. Y falta hay mucha tela, así que todavía falta mucho de qué hablar.
Yeah.
Okay?
Long live the notorious RBG. Yeah.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. For sure. That is, that's who we dedicated the program to.
8645 1103.
Okay. You got it.
Juega
Ladies
ese
and gentlemen.
número.
Juega ese número. All right, man. We'll see you all. Thank you so much. God bless. Take care. Bueno, mi gente, mucha materia. Ahí nos quedamos cortos de tiempo porque ya ustedes vieron, escucharon toda esa información histórica. Y el libro, por favor, el libro de Chris Washburne vale la pena. Así que espero que sea de su agrado lo que acabamos de compartir. Mañana, domingo, tendremos una charla y va a ser bastante en español con Mary Kent, quien es la autora y fotógrafa del libro Salsa Talks, en el cual tendremos un grupo también de personas que se van a unir a nosotros para la conversación, la mesa redonda durante la segunda parte, donde estaremos hablando sobre el libro Salsa Talk. Tendremos a Mary Kent como invitada, Angelina Medina Quiroga de Perú estará con nosotros, Viviana María de Miami estará con nosotros, Aurora Flores de Nueva York estará con nosotros y nuestro amigo Johnny Giraldo estará con nosotros también, hablando sobre el libro titulado Salsa Talks. Así que quedan cordialmente invitados que estén con nosotros el día de mañana, comenzando a las 4. So tomorrow the theme will be Salsa Talk, a book written with photography by our dear friend Mary Kent. And we will have from Peru, Angelina Medina Quiroga. And from Miami, our dear friend Vivian Maria. And from New York, another dear friend, Aurora Flores. And right here from Boston, our dear friend, Johnny Giraldo. I hope it will be to your to your enjoyment as well. Así que será hasta mañana. Dios los bendiga a todos. No tuve tiempo de poder poner todo su... aquí José Casanova. Gracias a ti también, Melaza. Julia Ojeda, gracias a ti. Mañana nos vemos, Julia. Muchas gracias. Qué chévere, Cecilia dice. Chévere. Por acá. Elizabeth Davis, allá en Ohio. Qué bien, muchas gracias, Elizabeth. Would love to continue listening to these gentlemen. Hope they come back another time. We're going to do a part 2. We'll make that happen, okay? And David, thank you, Jose, for this crowd. David, I look forward to doing it again with them. And I hope you join us tomorrow for what we'll be doing mañana as well, okay? So thank you all. God bless you. Until tomorrow, be safe. Latino, defiende lo tuyo con orgullo, todos unidos entre amigos, uno para todos y todos para uno. El nombre mío es José Mazó. Lo invito a que estén conmigo mañana por la tarde de 4 a 6 para la segunda parte, cuando tendremos American Salsa Talks. Hasta mañana, Dios los bendiga. Until tomorrow, God bless you. Take care. Be well.